Ladies and gentlemen, this is Rex Bear with Leak Project. Tonight we have guest Paul A. Green. Philosopher, author, screenwriter, occultist. Paul grew up in London and studied at Oxford and the University of British Columbia. Magical techniques are central to Mr. Green's writing practice, which is ultimately an exploratory process. Thus, his pursuit of the arcana of magic and the enigmas of esoterica is amplified not only in Babalon and other plays, but in poetry, as in his collection, Shearsman 2012, The Gospel Bunker, and in such novels as The Clip-Off, Libros Libertad, and Beneath the Pleasure Zones, Mandrake of Oxford 2014. He has made radio documentaries on aspects of the occult and paranormal, featuring Colin Wilson, Francis X. King, Ian Sinclair, among others, while the plays have been broadcast on BBC Radio, CBC Canada, RTE Ireland, and Resonance FM. All have been staged by Travesty Theatre and New Theatre Works. He has performed or presented at many venues, most recently at the Final Academy, Magic Art Bristol, the Moot with No Name, the Electric Palace Hastings, and St. Augustine's Tower in Hackney. He has especially enjoyed collaborations, whether with musicians like the late Vincent Crane or with the artist Jeremy Welsh, creating video poems like The Slow Learner and Radial City. Mr. Green now lives in Hastings. It's great to have you on the show tonight with us here at the Leak Project. Paul, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Rex. And it's a pleasure to be invited. I'm actually in Hastings, which is about 50 miles from London, in the town where Aleister Crowley died in 1947. So there's a sort of occult connection, if you like, in the actual location I'm situated with. Although that's not the reason I necessarily moved here. But there are sort of Aleister Crowley landmarks in Hastings. The house where he lived was demolished many years ago, but there are still places around town where he used to hang out. And, I like to think his spirit sort of hovers vaguely in the background somewhere.
Was he buried out there as well?
No, he was. It's a strange story. He died in 1947. He was cremated in Brighton, and then the ashes went to America to Carl Germer, one of his disciples, who apparently buried them under a tree. And then Germer sort of forgot where they were buried, and I think and there's a possibility that they got lost or scattered or dug up or something. So they disappeared upon the wind, I think. But yeah, it's Hastings is a good place to be. There's a lot of cultural activity going along here, and lots of music and lots of writers. So I feel quite at home here.
Sure, and I know the UK is the culture out there. There's been hermetics and the occult and mysticism for just thousands of years out there, and it's very fascinating. What really got you into the occult, Paul?
Well, it's a curious thing. I was educated as a Roman Catholic. My father was a Catholic, and outwardly he was a very conventional man. But he had this, there were strange books that he would purchase, sometimes with the bewilderment of my mother. And so at quite a young age, I read A. Waite's books on ceremonial magic, and the Simmons biography of Crowley, and so on and so forth. And this I pursued this at various levels, not too seriously at first. And then when I was in Canada in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and I was sort of seeing myself through grad school by doing some freelance broadcasting, and I suggested a program about Aleister Crowley and magic to a CBC producer I knew, and he said, go for that. So I started doing a lot more reading and research, and I'm not a joiner. I've never really been a member of a particular order. There are certain sort of processes and practices I've investigated. But to me, the real magical act is the act of writing. Partly because of the techniques that I've used. I mean, things that are common to other writers, like, sort of automatic writing that the surrealists used, cut-ups like William Burroughs used. Burroughs, incidentally, has got a very strong occult strain in his work. There's a particularly good book I'd recommend, written by a friend of mine, actually, called The Magical Universe of William Burroughs. But that's an aside. So there are certain sort of procedures I got interested in at some points in sigil magic. And there were certain things that one experimented with as a writer. I've always felt that writing is a magical act. You create mental pictures. Hopefully you create sort of little archetypes that will resonate in other people's mental spaces. But I don't make any claims to be a great magus or anything. I've always seen myself as a scribe, insofar as I have any formal religious beliefs at all now. I do identify quite a bit with the Egyptian god Thoth, who was the god of magic, the god of writing, who compares pretty well to the sort of Jehovah, whereas the biblical Jehovah sends plagues and destruction and slays the firstborn. Thoth, teaches the Egyptians writing and magic and all sorts of, skills. So I think as a deity, he's pretty good. But I'm drifting here.
Well,
Rex, so ask me a question.
I'm really glad you brought up Thoth, because that's a perfect segue there. I've always been fascinated with Thoth as well. And do you think that the emerald tablets of Thoth are legit, or do you think that that's something that was kind of made up?
Well, I think the whole sort of Thoth Hermes Trismegistus thing evolved over quite a long period of time. Some people have argued that the Hermetic texts were actually written in the early sort of post-Christian era, in second or third centuries. Others claim that there's a much further connection back. As to whether the emerald tablet exists in any physical form now, I don't know, and I suppose I have my doubts. But as to the basic concept of as above, so below, as William Butler put it, as the great Smaragdine tablet said, then I think it's a useful concept. Let me put it like that.
Well, and there's a lot in the. Have you read the actual texts?
Yes, I have. Yes, I mean the texts are very resonant, I think, and but as to whether we can how far we can link them back to the Egyptian god Thoth, I don't know. Not being an Egyptologist.
Are you familiar with the majority or some of the, I guess you could say, higher archetype gods of Egypt, ancient Egypt?
Well, obviously through reading Crowley and reading the Book of the Law, one encounters Horus, Nuit, and Set, to name three principal figures, and I think that again, as archetypes, they are, psychologically very powerful and very resonant.
Do you think that they were real? I mean, real people at one time, or actual gods that came down from the heavens?
Well, once again, another open question. To some extent, all right, they could be based on powerful or influential individuals in the prehistory of Egypt or the prehistory of other societies. They could be based on some kind of external or alien intervention in the past. To some extent, they could be entities who exist because we have imagined them. Are you familiar with the work of the British chaos magician Peter Carroll?
Oh yeah, yeah, Peter,
Yeah,
absolutely, great guy.
yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, I think he's the most interesting and important writer on the occult since Crowley, and I've done one of his Arcanorium online studies
What was
as
that
well.
like?
It was fascinating. The thing that interested me most of all, that most of the correspondence on the Arcanorium College were terrifyingly intelligent physicists. And I was soon struggling to keep up with their mathematics because my background is in English and the humanities rather than physics and maths. And actually, the paradox is that the sciences are actually seem to be quite good training for magicians. Referencing Crowley's study of chemistry at Cambridge. Yeah, that was very stimulating, and I think that Carroll's created a new paradigm really, one that's more open ended, less hierarchical, more fluid, and I've found it throughout the certainly throughout the novels, the idea of a chaotic universe in which a multiplicity of entities evolved in a way as a kind of mirror image of our interaction with them. I think that's fascinating. I don't know if I've explained that terribly well because it's a concept that is difficult to grasp. But I think that Carroll is Carroll's a key figure, no doubt about it.
Now, the chaos magic is an incredible form of different modules to achieve results. I've talked to several people like Andrea Vitamus on chaos magic. I had a really cool show here the other day on chaos magic, and what I find fascinating is the results connected with a proper manifestation, doing something the correct way, you get results, you can see it for yourself. And one of the things too about Aleister Crowley that is just so I think made him ahead of his time was he really kind of pushed this concept of do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. And people would look at that. I mean, there's two different mindsets to that statement. In my opinion, and I would love to hear what you have to say about this because I could be way off, but in that statement, will would be somebody's highest purpose, and anything below that is obviously just, it doesn't matter as much. And some people think it means you can go do whatever the hell you want and there's no repercussions.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on that. I think by will he meant your deepest aspirations, what you are destined to do. Every man and woman is a star and follows a particular path or orbit. But finding that path and disentangling it from all the distractions along the way is, I think, a bit of a danger zone. In fact, in all the occult dramas that I've written in the Babalon and other plays, this is a recurrent theme. I mean, we'll talk a bit later about Jack Parsons because Parsons is a more complex figure than this. But for example, have you ever heard of a British jazz and rock musician called Graham Bond?
Yes.
Right. And you know that he committed suicide or apparently committed suicide, or perhaps was nudged in some direction to commit suicide under a subway train in 1974 in London. Bond became an avid disciple of Crowley and Thelema in the late 60s, early 70s. But he seemed to have regarded that more or less as a license to do what the hell he liked, with sometimes disastrous repercussions, both for himself and those closest to him. And I think there's always a temptation to feel that if you buy the books and you have the robes and you imbibe large quantities of substances, that somehow this is automatically going to elevate you to some kind of godhead. But I'm afraid in Graham's case, it didn't work out that way at all, because he sort of spiraled down into massive heroin addiction, which he couldn't handle. His relationships broke down. It is alleged, and there's good reason for it, that he had an abusive relationship with his stepdaughter. And eventually was in a position where he couldn't hold a band together. He couldn't work with anybody. And he drifted into suicide. So, if you like, that's an example of how, misplacing your true will, because I think Bond was destined to do great things. He was a brilliant musician. He was a very charismatic performer. He was one of the sort of catalysts in, the development of British jazz and rock. He nurtured people like Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, who promptly went off to form Cream. He nurtured lots of other musicians, including my late friend Vincent Crane, who was Arthur Brown's keyboard player. You've probably heard of The Crazy World of Arthur Brown. Uh-huh. I am the God of Hellfire. Graham is an example of a man with tremendous potential, who at the same time couldn't really sort of control the forces that he was dealing with, and couldn't control his habit. I mean, in the end, both Crowley and Burroughs managed to contain, if you like, their morphine, or in Burroughs' case, methadone habit, and sort of managed to live with it on a daily basis. But Bond was just completely out of control. So there's an example, perhaps, of somebody who had enormous potential, whose true will should have been to gone on to be a major figure in British popular music, but he blew it tragically.
Well, and also the Beatles were really into the occult, mysticism. Aleister Crowley, I mean, even on one of their album covers, they had him there. And he certainly has had a huge impact on society as we know it in the entertainment industry, the political realms, etc. One of the things that I found, I did read his, what he called magnum opus, the Book of Four, and the 4 different books in there, the Book of the Law, and then he talked about practical magic and stuff like that. But one specific part in that book that really tripped me out was when I'm trying to remember it exactly, and I'm sure you know this part as well. He talks about how he would take blood from kids and use it for his rituals.
Now this is is this the famous comment? The Master Therian made this sacrifice approximately 120 times a year.
Correct. And then he said, "I'm telling you this," or something like, he worded it as, "I'm telling people this in hopes that they'll understand it," or something like that.
Now what was happening there was something a little different. Crowley, like Parsons, his disciple, practiced sexual magic, and some of it was with partners, but some of it was eighth degree autosexual magic, which was effectively masturbation, but in a magical context. It was the discharge of a vital bodily fluid, usually in the case of Parsons, it was onto a slip of parchment with an Enochian symbol on it. And what Crowley was saying was that he'd sacrificed his precious vital fluid in the cause of magic 120 times a year, and that this was a sort of veiled way of talking about it. Because Crowley in some ways, he was extremely sort of extrovert and outspoken about sexual magic, but he was also a little bit wary of talking about it too explicitly in some contexts. I think one of the things to bear in mind about Crowley that he was bisexual, and I think the gay element in his personality was something that he wasn't always very happy with, or that he was defensive about. I remember that he grew up in the 1890s. When Oscar Wilde was tried and jailed and for homosexual practices. Homosexuality wasn't legal in this country till 20 years after Crowley's death. So there are aspects of sex that he would talk about quite openly, but sometimes he would hide it in veiled language. So that's what the reference is. All the stuff about Crowley's human sacrifices was a sort of tabloid invention. He did sacrifice animals on a couple of occasions, which is something to me is a less attractive aspect of his personality. I'm quite happy about him sort of, coming over bits of parchment, but, slitting the throat of goats, I think, is perhaps going, too far. So he did, Crowley was extraordinary in that he was in some ways a victim of his own publicity. He was desperate, I think, to make his mark. He was desperate to rebel against that appallingly oppressive Christian fundamentalist upbringing that he'd had with the Plymouth Brethren. He was desperate to wake up the rather sort of stodgy world of everyday Edwardian daily life, and so he would make outrageous statements. He would wind people up in all sorts of ways. The tabloids would take him up. He'd soon be the wickedest man in the world, according to them. And I think Crowley was so complex and so paradoxical that effectively, I think he did himself a disservice by endlessly sort of seeking the limelight. At the same time, I can see why he was driven to do it, given the circumstances in which he'd been brought up. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. He did talk about his upbringing, and obviously he went to the opposite side of the spectrum.
Absolutely.
And I can see that. That's just like a kid rebelling from their parents, 100%. So, one of the things that I find fascinating, and you brought this up, a little bit when you talked about the jazz musician Graham that died from mysterious circumstances. I'm sure you've heard of the 27 Club.
No, I haven't. Enlighten me.
Okay. The 27 Club is a group of musicians and movie stars that died at the age of 27. I'll give you a few examples. Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Amy Winehouse, a whole bunch more that at strange circumstances at the age of 27, they died. And there's a lot of speculation. Kurt Cobain was one of them. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of speculation that they might have signed some type of contract, a blood contract, a soul contract, or whatever, to get that fame. And then once they reached it, their contract was met, bang, they're 27, and then that's their sacrifice. Brian Jones, Janis Joplin. There's so many more people that at 27, it's like that's the magic number. Bang, they're done. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Bond was born in 38 and he died in 74, so that makes him 36.
Yeah, he was 36.
But talking of contracts, though, there are a couple of strange stories about Bond. Bond was in America in the early 70s, and he'd been brought over by this guy who said that he was going to manage Bond and turn him into an international superstar. And Bond, but there was a problem with Bond's work permit, so he signed a contract without reading the small print, and the manager said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." And then Bond's wife realised that they weren't getting any money, and the contract actually said that 90% of it was going to the manager. So Bond performed a rite in my play about Bond, I don't know what right I gave him, the Bournless right that Crowley often used, slightly modified. So in my play, Bond, standing in the City of Angels in Los Angeles, calls down forces in retribution. The next day, the manager's wife was involved in a major car accident in which some unfortunate person was killed. There's another story about Bond told to me by a friend of mine, a British writer and musician called Pete Brown, who was one of the songwriters for the Cream, and he'd worked with Bond as well. And he was with Bond in Germany in the late 60s or early 70s, and it was a time when Germany was going through a very turbulent phase of revolution and terrorism, and there was a particularly there was a publisher, a newspaper magnate called Axel Springer, who was sort of denouncing, hippies and radicals and so on very fiercely. Bond appeared at this gig, and Bond said quite casually, "Who's the worst man in Germany?" And the guy organising the gig said, "Oh, it's Axel Springer," who was a kind of German equivalent, I suppose, of Rupert Murdoch, name some other big newspaper proprietor. Bond pronounced an ancient Egyptian curse, and the next day there was an explosion at Springer's offices. Springer was unhurt, but various people were injured. Bond's career seems to have been surrounded with these sort of strange synchronicities that seem to have been linked to his ritual practice, but not necessarily in a very constructive way. But anyway, you mentioned contracts, and I just thought I'd throw that in on passing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, as for deals with the devil, I mean, Robert Johnson, the blues singer, was supposed to have signed a deal with the devil, and there is a song, there's an old blues, which I won't attempt to sing, called "Dealing with the Devil," which I think is a Johnson song, and I think Sonny Boy Williamson sang it as well. But anyway, that's another digression. I'll tell you what, do you want to, I don't know how you want to work through this, do you want to get back to Babalon, or the Babalon working? Because we've got a bit of background. We got a bit of background now on Crowley, and the sort of, a few things about the occult world in general. So, where do you want to go?
Yeah, let's transfer over to that. If you could tell our listeners about the Babalon working, the play, and the players, etc. That'd be fantastic.
Right. Okay, Jack Parsons his life is an enigma and his death is a mystery. Jack Parsons was two persons. He was one of the pioneers, the pioneer, in fact, of American solid fuel rocket research. And the work that he carried out in the 1930s and 40s created a reliable solid fuel technology that was developed and used in everything from the Minuteman missile to, in fact, the boosters for the space shuttle. So he is an important man in the history of American space travel. He was also Aleister Crowley's leading disciple for a while on the west coast of America, in Pasadena, California, where he became for a while the leader of the Agape Lodge of Crowley's Order of Oriental Templars. So, as for the Babalon working, it's a long and complicated story, but I'll try and tell it as best I can. Parsons came from a fairly wealthy background, but they fell upon hard times. He wasn't able to stay through college, and so he left and he worked in a explosives factory for a couple of years, learning a great deal about explosives. He'd always been fascinated by rockets and explosions and the possibility of space travel, and he avidly read science fiction, and he was fascinated by the dark and mysterious. He once said that he'd encountered the devil at the age of 14 and had been very terrified. Whether that was a Parsons embellishment or whether it referred to something deeper, I don't know. So you have this very bright, very charismatic guy. He blanks his way into what later became the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL. In the late 1930s, without many formal qualifications, but with a great gift for understanding the possibilities of rocket fuels and explosives. He conducts various experiments in the around Pasadena with the sort of the Caltech being rather sort of worried about his sometimes reckless experimenting, and he starts to read about Crowley and about occultism. And in the late 1930s, I think in 1939 or 1940, he joins the Pasadena Lodge of the Order of Oriental Templars. It's led by an expatriate Englishman called Wilfred Smith. Smith is a bit sort of lackadaisical. And Aleister Crowley, who is very dependent on the Agape Lodge because the Agape Lodge subscriptions are effectively his only income, thinks that Parsons sounds a far more sort of dynamic figure, and very rapidly Parsons becomes the head of the Agape Lodge. But there are complications. Parsons' wife, Helen, is rapidly seduced by Smith, and this becomes actually has a child by him, and this becomes a test of Parsons' sort of libertarian views of sexuality. Do what thou wilt to be the whole of the law, but he's doing it with my wife. But Parsons decided he had to overcome this. He had to deal with this, which he did, and he eventually hitched up with her sister Betty, and they became an item. He had a certain amount of money. He bought a large house in Pasadena, in Orange Grove Avenue, which rapidly became called the Parsonage, and it became a focal point for science fiction writers who used to hang out there, like Robert Heinlein, other sort of mystics and magicians from the local OTO, actors, engineers. He once put an ad in the local paper saying "Bohemians wanted," and he sort of selected people as to how sort of nonconformist they were and how willing they would be to fit in with the sort of very libertarian style of the lodge. And they started conducting, the Gnostic Mass used to be conducted in Smith's attic, but now it was conducted in Parsons' mansion. And he became increasingly interested in the female archetype of Babalon, who occurs in John Dee's Enochian magical system as a recurrent figure, who is the Scarlet Woman in Aleister Crowley's Book of the Law, and he becomes increasingly engrossed in this. And then at some point in 1945, Lafayette Ronald Hubbard arrives. Yes, that Hubbard, later of Scientology fame, arrives, and Parsons is absolutely overwhelmed by this, another very sort of charismatic figure. And they begin to carry out magical experiments together so that Parsons can find that he can actually somehow bring into existence Babalon. The experiments went on through early 1946. They involved the kind of sort of ritual sexual activities that I've talked about earlier with Crowley. They involved long incantations from the Book of the Law, the Gnostic Mass, and from the calls and keys of the Enochian system. And Hubbard sort of assisted as scribe, and they began to generate phenomena. Some of them are rather odd. There was one of the strange things about the Enochian language is that it is a coherent language. Although it sounds like sort of random babble of syllables, it is actually very structured and it has a grammar and a syntax. And Dee's scryer, Edward Kelly, actually dictated a kind of dictionary to translate the Enochian tongue. And towards at a fairly late stage in the workings, Parsons started to get auditory phenomena. One night he got a series of very loud knocks, and of its own volition, a large table lamp crashed over. Now, the word for lamp in Enochian is Hubar, Hubar, and it's very tempting to see a connection there between L. Ron Hubbard. By the end of the workings, as they progressed, they began to generate more and more phenomena. Also Parsons perceived it. They believed that they'd seen a tall, yellowish brown entity. There were inexplicable failings in the electrical system. Hubbard got an enormous electrical shock, which he claimed paralyzed his right arm. I think by the end of this first working, they were in a pretty strange space. And then, not quite out of the blue, because she had met Jack very briefly before, a few months previously, there came to see Jack Marjorie Cameron Parsons, whom Jack immediately identified as his Scarlet Woman. And so that was the first phase of the Babalon working.
What is a Scarlet Woman?
Well, a Scarlet Woman, according to Crowley, the Scarlet Woman could be identified with the Scarlet Woman in the Book of Revelations in the Bible, where she's presented in a very negative light, being seen through a sort of Christian lens, as being destructive, assertive, sexualized, and so on. But as far as Crowley was concerned, the Scarlet Woman was Babalon, was, if you like, the woman of the future, who was strong, fierce, independent, sexually self-confident. Crowley used to call his mistresses Scarlet Women. And he will frequently talk about the union of the beast and the Scarlet Woman as both a sexual union and also a mystical union as well. Sorry, let me just backtrack there. Does that answer your question about the Scarlet Woman?
Yeah, thank you very much. 100%.
Okay, right. Okay, then. So that's the first phase. That's the first phase of the working. Cameron and Parsons have a very intense affair. Initially, Cameron is rather skeptical or dismissive of Parsons' magic. She sees him as being, a brilliant, dynamic guy who's wonderful in bed and so on. And I think they spent 2 weeks in bed engaged in sexual magic. But it's later on, with Ron's involvement, that they begin to take part in a second series of workings. Now, here there is some confusion and disagreement about what Parsons was actually trying to do. And it depends, what source you read, and if you compare what Cameron said and what actually happened, and so on. Parsons said that the second series of workings were going to bring forth Babalon. It wasn't clear to what extent he expected Babalon to be born as a physical child to Cameron. Apparently she did become pregnant, but terminated it, which rather suggests that he wasn't perhaps thinking in those terms, although he might have been at some point. It's as if he expected some kind of force to arise that would be the strong female, if you like, a feminist force that would transform the world and transform society and transform people's perception of belief and understanding, that would create a new religion, if you like.
Which is Thelema, do you think?
Well, Parsons thought that this was an extension of Thelema. He felt that Thelema was a bit too sort of masculine oriented, and he felt that the feminine current had to be given an equal balance. So as far as we can see, he sort of cast this role on Cameron at first, and then Cameron was still very skeptical about it. Years later, after Parsons' death, she thought for a while that that she was the Scarlet Woman, and then later on, she realised perhaps that she was just an expression of some invisible entity or presence that was that had this transformative quality. Dealing with this whole topic, it's difficult because there's still a lot about Parsons that we don't know. When I started writing this play in 1998, what I had to go on was the various biographies of Crowley, obviously. Let me see. There was a very good article by a British occultist called Michael Staley called Beloved of Babalon. There was Russell Miller's book about Hubbard, which had something about the working. And there were several websites that have now disappeared. There was a very good one called Avatar of the 11th Hour, which is now down. There was another one called Jack Parsons on the Origins of the American Space Program that's now disappeared. And so I was kind of cobbling things together based on what I could find on the internet and general reading. And even as I rewrote the play several times, and particularly when Sex and Rockets came out, which was by Paul Rydeen, writing under the name of John Carter, which is very good on the magical aspects. And later on, there's another good biography of Parsons by George Pendle called Strange Angel. And that's not so good on the magic, but it's very good on the rocketry side of things. So those two books give you an overall picture. But I was working to some extent in the dark. I was also writing a play where one has to be selective. You've got 90 minutes to tell a long, complex story, so things will get elided together and compressed. So, all art is a lie, as Jean Cocteau said, but all art lies in order to tell the truth. And I think, although there are some factual and chronological inaccuracies in my play, and there are some things which we simply don't know the answer to, I like to think that it's got this essence of Jack as a kind of questing figure who took great risks with his personal life, great risks with rocketry as well, as we'll see in a minute. Anyway, eventually the Parsons-Hubbard relationship fractured when Hubbard went off to the East Coast ostensibly to start a yacht importing business, taking with him Betty and all of Parsons' savings, because he'd sold the big mansion by then. And Parsons found out that that Hubbard was having a wild riotous time on the East Coast with Betty, having bought 3 yachts and obviously had no intention of coming back. So he went after him, and once again, Parsons performed a ritual he called on Batsabal, the dog of war, and very conveniently, that while Betty and Ron were out at sea in one of the yachts, there was a serious storm and they had to come back to harbour. Anyway, eventually the partnership that he'd set up with Hubbard was dissolved, but Hubbard somehow seemed to get most of the money, or at least get the yachts, and Parsons was hit quite hard by this financially, but very deeply emotionally. So he moved away from thelemic magic for a while. He thought that it was too complex, too hierarchical for the average person. And in his later books, he wrote about what he called the witchcraft, which seems to have been a sort of simpler, more intuitive kind of magical practice, closer, in fact, to sort of traditional witchcraft, and perhaps closer to Wicca, which was evolving in Europe and particularly in England at the same time. And then, of course, there was the ultimate tragedy. I mean, Parsons' behaviour brought him to the attention of the authorities. At one point, he was considered a serious security risk. They thought he was a loose cannon, that he'd run off to Israel with secrets that he'd purloined from Hughes Aircraft Company. He got fired from Hughes Aircraft. He got he was cross-examined by the FBI, who thought he was might be a communist, or that his occult connections might be a security risk in some way. So at one point he was reduced to working in a gas station, and later on he picked up a job working for explosives and special effects company. And by 1952, after a series of up and down relationships with Cameron, they'd got back together again. And they were going to go to Mexico, where Jack had hopes of starting a laboratory and possibly a factory. And on our summer afternoon in 1952, he'd rented a little sort of coach house type place, and where he kept all his explosives, and he went back to pack a few explosives. And it looks like he dropped some fulminate of mercury, and that explosion set off another explosion. And as a result, the laboratory was wrecked. He was very seriously injured. He lost an arm and half of his face, and only lived for a few hours afterwards. And of course, there the enigma widens. I mean, the conventional explanation is, which is quite reasonable, is Parsons was always reckless using explosives. He sweated a lot. He could well have dropped something. He was in a hurry. He was packing the car to go off to Mexico with Cameron. There are other strands in the story, though, that are interesting. Back in 1938, Parsons was called in as an expert witness in the trial of a Los Angeles cop who'd murdered a private detective who was delving into city corruption, who had murdered this private detective, or attempted to murder him, I should say, because the guy actually survived, by putting a bomb in his car. And Parsons was called in at the age of 23 as a bright young expert witness to analyse the aftermath of the explosion and to describe how a bomb could cause this level of destruction. And Parsons created a big impression in court because he actually came in with a replica bomb that he constructed and waved it at the jury, and everybody was very impressed, and he had a certain amount of press coverage for this. And Cameron for a while thought that possibly this Kinnett would have got out of jail for attempted murder the previous year, and possibly it was a revenge attack. And she always claimed that the explosion was actually under the floor and not on the floor or on the table. There's another line of inquiry, which is that the FBI wanted to get rid of him. again, because they felt he was a security risk. I mean, he was a man who'd pioneered, some of America's leading rocket technology, and he hung about with dubious people, and he might sort of go off to, there was talk of him going off to Israel at one point and starting a rocket manufacturing program there. There was also a rumour that has never really been substantiated that he was trying to create a homunculus in his laboratory, and this created an explosion. There's also, in the play, I suggest, or it's implied, that yes, Parsons is in a hurry and he's nervous and he needs to pack all this stuff away. But at the same time, there are certain, if you like, subliminal impulses that are possibly been implanted in his brain by Hubbard. One of the texts, so one of the channelings, I should say, that Hubbard got in the second working was something about "thou shalt become living flame," and in the play, I've suggested there are sort of internalized voices in his head, with overall the voice of Ron saying, "Thou shalt become living flame. Drop it, drop it, drop it," and he drops it. So, an extraordinary figure. It's interesting, seeing as you like synchronicities, and so do I, that in 1947 you have the death of Crowley, you have the end of the Babalon working, you have the discovery of lysergic acid by Hoffman in Switzerland, you have Burroughs, Ginsberg, Kerouac and co. meeting in New York. You have the UFO sightings of Keith Arnold.
I'm glad you brought that one up.
Yeah. And you have the development of the transistor. You have John Van Neumann and co. bringing the computer. I've said enough. You bring something. You bring something.
I just got
Rex.
Yeah.
I got carried away. I got on a roll there. Sorry about that.
Please, no apologies necessary. That was fantastic. I was just enjoying the ride, man. So Lamb is a figure that Crowley makes contact with, and the reason I'm bringing Lamb up is because if you see a picture or a drawing that Crowley puts together, Lamb looks very similar to what many call an alien, or a gray, the typical Hollywood version. So, and then in 47 also you've got Roswell, this incredible phenomenon of all these flying saucers and abductions, and there's some speculation there that some of the works these guys did actually created an opening or a portal to another dimension, and I wanted to get your opinion on that.
Right. Kenneth Grant, who was Crowley's, to my mind, Crowley's most interesting disciple, although he sort of veered away, he got sort of disinherited by the American OTO, precisely because he was making these sort of connections. He said in 1947, Parsons opened a portal and something flew in. It's a very tempting speculation. I think, I don't have the exact reference to this at my fingertips, but certainly after Parsons' death, Cameron believed that she'd seen UFOs. There was a rumor that Parsons actually knew Arnold, the businessman with the private plane who actually coined the phrase "flying saucers." Back in 47. The Lamb phenomenon is very, very curious. I think Crowley drew it back in, I think, with one of his Scarlet Women. I think it was Roddy Minor, and there was a sort of exchange between them, and I can't remember the exact wording, but afterwards, Crowley drew this curious entity called Lamb, And sorry about that. I think I must just switch off my email. It's prompted me there. I'll just go back a bit. Hang on a minute there.
Sure.
It's all right. I've just my email has told me that David Cameron has done something or hasn't. I don't know. That was another weird thing. The night the play Babalon was performed in December the 16th, 2005, the Conservative Party in the UK was still in opposition, but there was some confusion. There was there were sort of battles over the leadership, and I will swear, and this is from memory, I can't vouch, I will swear that on the night of the play, I opened the Evening Standard, and the headline was "Cameron takes charge," which, except it was the wrong Cameron. I wish it had been. Well, she would have been a bit old by then, but yes, I think Marjorie Cameron for Prime Minister would have been an interesting possibility. But I think Parsons had a discussion with Wilfred Smith, and I've got it in the play, in which he says these lights in the sky, they're not necessarily nuts and bolts machines. They're actually alien. They are entities in themselves. Now, one of the things, this is a little bit of a sidetrack, but let's just explore it. One of the interesting things about the whole UFO phenomenon is the extraordinary diversity of sightings in terms of the shape and size and color and motion, and the extraordinary diversity in contactee experiences, all the way from the benevolent people who greet George Adamski to the unpleasant people that Betty and Barney Hill met, who conducted medical experiments on them. So what's going on here? I think something very interesting and strange is going on, but I don't think it's necessarily, nuts and bolts metal spacecraft. It's there's Jung's idea that flying saucers appear in the sky because they respond to our unconscious sort of anxieties and concerns, and we see apocalyptic changes signified in whatever the imagery is of a particular century or a particular culture. So in the 19th century, people see flying ships, and if you go back a bit further in medieval times, they see flying chariots or flying carts or whatever.
Right.
So I think what we have here is it's entities which would appear to have some kind of autonomous existence, but they represent themselves using the language and imagery of our popular culture. And what it all means in the long run, I do not know. I mean, some people have speculated there are actually time travelers from the future. Once again, that goes back to the idea of flesh and blood machines. One can also link it with the alternate universe idea, which is what I use as a strand in the novels, as an ongoing theme, and that they are intruders, visitors, friendly or otherwise, from other planes of existence in a parallel or even a divergent universe. And then here we get into the very interesting area where sort of magic and science sort of grope each other in the dark and present us with some very interesting questions. So that's my take. I think that people who report UFO sightings are, by and large, pretty genuine. I think there are a large number that are obviously mistakes, like, mistaken aircraft. And it has been said that the CIA actually encouraged and nurtured the cult of ufology and UFOs as a way of distracting people away from, experiments with stealth bombers and other unconventional aircraft, which is another possibility. But even if you eliminate all those, there are certain things that just do not add up in conventional terms. And I think we're seeing a phenomenon that we don't really have a language for. I think the French writer Jacques Vallée, who appeared in a cameo role in Close Encounters, I think his books, like Passport to Magonia, offer some very interesting insights in this. And I have to say, I'm sorry, I'm branching off here on another of my digressions. I have played around with flying saucers in a book I wrote under a pseudonym called Space Virgins of the Third Reich, which is not to be taken entirely seriously. It's an erotic novel, actually, about a young girl who, she's not that young. She's 19, and she's on a film studies, media studies course, and her lecturer, who's a rather sinister character, gets her to do a project on a film called Space Virgins of the Third Reich, which is a B-movie about Nazi flying saucers. But as the thing unfolds, the B-movie about flying saucers corresponds to the alleged Nazi experiments with flying saucers, one of which is still buried in the UK to this day. And you can read all about it. Sorry, that's a bit of self-indulgence there, but I did have fun writing Space Virgins of the Third Reich.
Could you, could you tell us a little bit about that? That sounds fascinating.
Well, the idea was to write. I wrote under pseudonym Saul Wolfe because I wanted to keep a separate identity from my more serious books. The idea was to write something entertaining, sexy, but also had some strong characters and had a real storyline. So we begin in England in the present day, and there's sort of Ruth, who's a very bright young thing, who's fascinated by the culture of the fashion and the movies of the 1950s, and she has this lecturer called Mr. Steele, and Mr. Steele is tall, crew cut, blonde, Aryan type. And he jokingly suggests to Ruth that if she wants to do a really A-plus film studies project, she should research Space Virgins of the Third Reich, although he has some doubts as to whether the film was actually ever existed. And Ruth, at first, she can't find anything out about it. And then with the help of her equally sexy and voluptuous friends, she meets various people who can help her, and she gradually sort of unpeels this narrative. And at the same time, there is this British sort of, if you like, far sort of pseudo-Nazi group who are also after the film, and and Steele is initiated with them via various peculiar rituals of an erotic and bizarre nature. Anyway, the whole thing sort of progresses to a climax in many senses of the word, with the discovery of a buried Nazi UFO in a disused hangar somewhere in the south of England. By this time, this has become a political hot potato as well. I won't... The ending is a little too complicated and maybe a little too... It sounds ridiculous and implausible if you try to summarize it, so I'll leave it there. But
let's save that for the book.
It's a 5-star romp on Amazon, according to some people. Some of them, a couple of them are friends of mine, actually, but there we are. But there's a moral in this. You see, if you try and go commercial, it never works because the book's never made me much money. I thought it was going to be my pension, but it hasn't. Anyway, to get, I think, have we anything more about Parsons that you want to look at?
I got to tell you, you really put together a neat timeline about Parsons. I know a lot more about him now than I did before, and I'm sure our listeners do as well. What a fascinating life, and sad indeed what he had to go. And then you look at Hubbard, which created the Scientology, all the billions of dollars in control that organization has, and
Yeah.
Dianetics, and just fascinating. And getting into Scientology, that's a whole other subject, but they certainly do a good job of keeping people in that organization once they sign
Oh
up.
God, yes, they do indeed. People said I was crazy to write a play with L. Ron Hubbard in it, but I went ahead and did it. Eventually I sent the final draft to the BBC. It was a very nice American guy there, a producer called Ned Shea. And Ned said, "This is fascinating, Paul, but you've got too many characters and it's too long. So can you do a rewrite?" So I did a rewrite. And he said, "Right, I think it's ready to go. We're at the final stage." He said, "I like it, but I've got to get the approval of the head of drama and the head of Radio 4. And then they just dropped, and he said, "We need to get the legal department to look at it too." And then the BBC dropped it like a hot potato. They didn't want to know. And my guess is that they were worried about having even a fictional portrayal of Ron Hubbard, which I felt was ridiculous. And when a stage version of the play was performed for that one nighter in London in 2005, the Scientology office in London was only a few blocks away. People said, "You're crazy, My oldest son was very worried. "Dad, you're kind of walking around with an armored waistcoat, But I'm still here." And of course, that there's a guy called, oh God, I've forgotten his name. There's an American guy, a nice bloke who lives in Pasadena, whose mother worked on various rocket projects at JPL, but I don't think with Parsons. And he's written a play called Pasadena Babalon, but the emphasis there is on the rocketry, and I think the occult thing is sort of treated for comedy, really. There's a guy called there's an Irish guy who's written quite an interesting play about Crowley and Parsons, but it's, as far as I know, I've lost contact with him now. It's never been produced.
Now, with your play that you put together, I mean, do you have it set up to where different theaters across the country or globe might have an opportunity to do it?
Well, we've had an inquiry. My publisher had an inquiry from a theatre group in Phoenix, and I replied to them and said, "Yes, I'm interested, but that's gone dead at the moment. I haven't heard for several weeks, so that may fizzle out." As always, it's just a question of getting, time and money and support. I'm hoping the publication of this book will attract interest, as it has. It's evidenced by the fact that the guys in Phoenix got in touch with me and that I'm talking to you right now. But cinematically, the Sex and Rockets book was optioned by Don Murphy, who's a big name in Hollywood. He did Transformers and all sorts of stuff. And he was very keen to do it. And a friend of mine emailed Murphy and said, "Well, I know two guys, one of them being me, one of them being the Irish guy. I said, I know two really bright guys who've written plays about Parsons and Crowley, and they do a great screenplay." And he immediately got a furious fax back from Murphy saying, "You touch this and I will sue you until you..." So having said that, I think Don Murphy has run into the sort of Hollywood Scientology phenomenon, because so many prominent Hollywood figures are Scientologists.
Right.
The irony is that John Travolta will be a fantastic Ron. He'd do it really well. Johnny Depp will be a great Parsons.
Yeah.
But I don't see that happening. Now, having said that, there's another, I think, just retract. Yeah, having said that, I don't think Murphy's going to go ahead, although he's still got the option on the book, because he is keen to do it. I don't know what he'd make of it. But in the meantime, something else has happened, because the other book on Parsons, the George Pendle book, has been optioned by Ridley Scott. And one of Ridley Scott's people is supposed to be making a television series. I think the emphasis is going to be more on the rockets the magic obviously has to come into it. Maybe Ron will come into it peripherally. Now, Ridley Scott is a serious guy whom I respect. And if he's producing it, I think we may see something good. I did, of course, email Ridley Scott's London office, but they never replied, as I'm not on I'm not a member of the Magic Hollywood Circle.
Bohemian Grove.
The Bohemian Grove. Yeah, I don't know what you have to join, the Skull and Bones. Anyway, so that's where we stand. I think we're going to see more about Parsons. The Ridley Scott is supposed to be a TV miniseries. So where and how that will surface, I don't know. I'd certainly like to have another crack at doing Babylon. I'd like to rewrite it, actually.
I'm sorry to interrupt here. My mind's going a million miles an hour. It would be fascinating to see, what your work, put a mini series together and put it on the Sci-Fi Channel. The Sci-Fi Channel recently had this amazing 3-part series called Childhood's End, which is based on the old book, Arthur C. Clarke.
Oh, that's a great book. I love that book. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, I haven't read the book. I'm going to now. That 3-part series blew my mind. It was absolutely incredible the way that they integrated this, extraterrestrial race coming down to Earth, and then the ETs look just like what most Christians would consider the devil. They had horns and stuff like that. But
that's right. Yeah.
But just the whole concept and the way that they integrated science and religion and revelations and everything else. And I'm not a religious person at all. I'm very neutral in that regard. But it was just neat to see everything put together. And yeah, I would love to see the Babalon and some of the plays that you've put together in a series on something like the Sci-Fi Channel. And I tell you, I think it would do really good, Paul, because people are interested in that kind of stuff right now. They're a lot more open to those things. And the fringe type aspects and the occult and the unknown is really getting to be mainstream. So if you could find a way to kind of, I guess, come up with an alias for Hubbard so you didn't have to piss off all those Scientology guys or something, man, that'd be awesome.
Yes. Perhaps what would we call him? Anyway, that's a digression. Yeah, that would be lovely, Rex. I'm working on it. I mean, I have been through various agents. The sort of literary world in the UK is very sort of rocky at the moment. I had one very good agent a few years ago, and then she went off and had a family, and then she switched entirely to doing other kind of stuff. I had another agent who was going to do my first novel, The Clip-Off, and was very excited about it. And then we didn't get anywhere because the guy who liked it had been made redundant. And eventually my agent gave up agenting and went off and became a psychotherapist, probably through talking to so many frustrated authors. Sorry, where were we? Give me a lead.
Sure, we were talking about the possibility of getting on to sci-fi or something like that, and some of the problems that you've gone through. Another thing I was, for those that are listening to the broadcast, please check out Paul's work. You can go to scarletimprint.com, and Paul's got an entire section there. And so I think it would be neat also with the plays that you do. Let me ask you, Paul, do you actually make them as realistic as possible when the characters perform some rituals, maybe not obviously the sexual ones, but whatever. I don't know. Maybe it is more of a exotic.
In the case of the Babalon play, we had an enormous advantage after the failure of the play with the BBC. I mentioned it to somebody I know who there's a wonderful occult bookshop in London called Treadwell's, in the Bloomsbury area, run by a very charismatic lady called Christina Oakley Harrington. And I mentioned this to Christina. I said, well, I've got this play. And she said, we're going to do it, without having even read it or seen it. And to cut a long story, she found me a young Canadian director, a very bright woman called Alison Rockbrand, who has a group called Travesty Theatre. And they said, right, well, Paul, if you can, pay for the hire of the venue, we'll do it. And a lot of them were heavily into the occult, were practicing occultists, and they rehearsed and I was at that time I was living in Hereford, which is quite distant from London. So I wasn't there for the rehearsals. And when I turned up for the final rehearsal just before the performance, I was absolutely blown away by the way they'd done the Enochian chanting. It was very, very powerful. And if you go onto YouTube and you type in QB Soul, that's my channel. And there are various things on it, including an old rock and roll band I used to perform with in the 70s. But there's also the audio of the 2005 performance with a kind of slideshow I've put together, including some of the images. The images that I sent you actually are a sample from that. So I was very, very lucky. I had people who were totally open to the concepts in the play, who were totally committed to giving it, the best possible performance. Obviously, with the rituals, given the limitations of the medium, you have to condense things. I mean, Parsons' rituals went on for hours and hours, and so I just had to do little condensations of that, and flashbacks, flash forwards, montages or collages, really. But yes, I was very keen to get the detail right. The chronology, as I said before, is a bit suspect, partly because I didn't have all the information, partly because we still don't have all the information, and partly because I was writing a play, which had to, fit a certain time length. I mean, I suppose if you could write a play about Parsons that lasted for sort of 14 hours or something, if you included all the rituals. But I don't know whether anybody would survive, whether the audience would survive it. So yes,
right.
the detail. So yes, it's important for me to get the details right, the atmosphere right, and the feeling right, and to take the subject seriously, which I think absolutely demands it. Yeah. So looking at the plays, the first play I had broadcast back in 1972 in Canada was, again, it relates, I think, to some of the interest of your listeners, because it was about dream control. It was called The Dream Laboratory. And the inspiration for this came from what I'd read about dream laboratory experiments in the States, particularly at the Maimonides Laboratory, and the work that Charles Honiton was doing, relating dream experiences to telepathic experiences. And so I wrote this play. It was heavily influenced by Marshall McLuhan and Burroughs and so on. And it's in the form of a mock documentary in which two reporters go to investigate the work of the Dream Laboratory and eventually become subjects themselves. And what is actually happening is that their dreams are being invaded and manipulated and then sort of erased or negated as a system of social control. So that becomes a metaphor for the media at large. And there were lots of collages of media fragments in there, bits of TV commercials and Vietnam War reportage and so on. And some of the the language becomes very, very surrealist as they describe as the subjects describe to the audience what they're actually experiencing, and then they become increasingly disturbed as the director of the laboratory tries to control and manipulate them. So that interest was there from the beginning, I suppose. But the next thing that I had broadcast, which was again, it was a strange encounter with the BBC, but it was broadcast, which was one of the strangest things about it. Have you or your listeners ever read a book called The Morning of the Magicians by Parsons and Bergier? Also came out as The Dawn of Magic.
I haven't heard of it.
Right, it was a bestseller in the 60s, and there was one phrase in it. It was about the occult Nazi phenomenon, and there was a phrase in it that senior Nazis would meet in the vault of Wewelsburg Castle to conduct the ritual of the stifling air. Well, I didn't know what the ritual of the stifling air was, but it was a very resonant phrase, and it triggered lots of things. And I wasn't in the best of spaces at that time, for a whole welter of reasons we don't need to go into at this point. And the idea of writing a play in which British neo-Nazi necromancers attempt to raise the spirit of the Führer in a séance was very, very compelling. I just had to do it, and I did it. So it's quite short. It's about 25 minutes. It's really like an extended poem. It is just a little introduction, and there's the ceremony, and that's it. And in the end, the Führer does come through, but not quite in the way that they're expecting. I sent this to the BBC. I actually sent it to a poet I knew in the poetry department, a guy called George Macbeth, who's sadly now dead. And George, in those days, the BBC was, if somebody really liked what you did, then they'd ask one other person about it and it would get done. You didn't have to go through dozens and dozens of committees like you do now. And George Macbeth liked this, and he passed it on to somebody else, and crazily enough, they decided to do it. And it took a long while. It took a year or so before it actually got recorded, with my friend Vincent supplying the music on piano and Hammond organ. I wasn't there for the recording session. And the BBC made a lot of this in the publicity about the play. What follows. Allegedly, the actors and the technicians became increasingly disturbed by curious noises and inexplicable breakdowns of equipment and curious sounds in the talkback and in the foldback in the studio and also in the control room. Now, having worked as a freelance broadcaster and also having performed in bands, I'm well aware of all the things that can go wrong in a recording studio and how you can get feedback and static, and signal flow can go all wrong and so on. But these were experienced engineers and an experienced producer, and so were the actors, and apparently they were really quite disturbed by this. Anyway, the play eventually did go out. Everybody hated it except the guy from the Observer, who said it was very powerful. And I think it was, and it was I suppose a kind of catharsis for me to write it. But I noticed the BBC, although they quite often recycle old drama performances, even going far back as the 60s and 70s, they've never recycled that on there. There is a channel devoted to called Radio 4 Extra where they recycle things. I should explain for your listeners that in the UK, radio drama is still quite a big thing. I mean, in the States, I think you only get it now on NPR or a few local stations. But here it's still quite big because it's a relatively cheap medium and it's very flexible. And, you can have a laboratory explosion or a necromantic Nazi ceremony, and you don't have to pay for the costumes or the special effects. Right. It's all there in the writing and the acting. So anyway, what happened then? There's a play which I didn't include in here because it is off topic. It's about my involvement in sort of punk rock and so on back in the day. But there are others in there which I think relate to your interest. I mean, there's the Graham Bond play, and there's a play about the electronic voice phenomenon. I'm sure, again, your listeners are familiar with this, and EVP. Oh, yeah. Yeah. EVP is very frustrating. I've never really got anywhere with it, despite having owned numerous old tape recorders. I wrote a play which eventually came out in Ireland about a guy trying to contact a man of advancing years, like myself, trying to contact the spirit of his dead girlfriend, whose death he has actually been responsible for, although that is something that he has repressed. And it begins in quite a comic way. this elderly, slightly eccentric man, talking into his tape recorder, and then his equally eccentric sister coming in and interrupting him and arguing with him and so on, and eventually agreeing to help him. And then it gets steadily darker as he hears her voice. She can't hear it. The listeners can hear it, but she can't, and he can. And the play ends with an enigma. What has he heard? His sister tries to persuade him that, it's all been a delusion or a technical fault with equipment. So I was quite pleased with the way the voice collection came out. Actually, again, I wasn't directly involved in the production at all. The producer did a brilliant job, great actors, and very subtle, understated sound effects. It's really nice. Going back to Alistair Crowley again, and going back to my father's interest in esoteric matters, one of the people my father corresponded with before the war and after the war was a man who is frequently mentioned in connection with witchcraft, usually in a rather derisory way because of his very eccentric take on it, and that was Father Montague Aloysius Somers, who may or may not have been a Catholic priest. Some people say he was bogus, who wrote a series of enormous books in the 1920s and 30s about witchcraft, about werewolves, about vampires. The Werewolf, His Kith and Kin was one of his titles. Witchcraft in Europe. And Somers believed fervently everything that he read in medieval accounts of witchcraft trials, and the Inquisition was always right and the witches were always wrong, and the Inquisition was doing a thoroughly good job of and the various witch finders, again, they were doing a very important job in saving us from the horrors and terrors of witchcraft, which, he said in a letter to my father, you're going to still find in our great cities today. So there was this extraordinary man, Somers, who was a sort of possibly a bogus priest who wrote copiously about magic and witchcraft. He also wrote about, he was an expert on Restoration, 17th century, 18th century theatre as well. He wrote about that. And the Gothic novel, he wrote about the Gothic novel. The thing about Somers was that it's emerged through more recent writings and biographies that he actually had a bit of a double life, that he'd known Crowley and actually sort of got on quite well with him. They chatted together quite cheerfully. And that Somers had also been involved in the Edwardian era and in the 1890s, during the First World War period, on Boxing Day 1918, in a black mass, which was celebrated with the aid of a friend of his and a rent boy from Piccadilly, because Somers was a repressed gay. And it just struck me that this, I took as a starting point for the play the fact that Somers is now elderly. He's with his, sitting in his little house in Richmond, and he reads Crowley's obituary in the paper, and he's terrified. He's afraid that all this is going to come out, so he starts to try and write his own account of what happens, but the reality of what happened keeps breaking through, and there are flashbacks to his meetings with Crowley, and one of the characters who've been involved in his sort of dubious cavortings in Edwardian times pops up again and starts nagging him and blackmailing him, and there's a woman he knows who believes that she's been possessed by Crowley, and he goes along to exorcise her, and eventually, and it's really Somers coming to terms with himself, as Crowley said. If at one point going back to this true will thing, Crowley says, he doesn't, paraphrasing it slightly, but he more or less says, your true will was not to be a priest, but to be be an actor, and your destiny was to be gay, and you would, as a gay actor, you would have been very fulfilled, but you chose to repress and sublimate and complicate all this, and now you're torturing this poor woman with this exorcism nonsense. And anyway, the thing eventually segues into Summers' death, having, I think, accepted some of the truths about himself. So so there are these sort of occult strands that run through the plays. It's the same thing with the books. Do you want to talk about the novels for a bit?
That'd be great. And before we get into the novels, I was just going to ask you a couple of questions because you brought up Dream Control and the Dream Laboratory play that you put together. Are you personally able to have an out-of-body experience? Can you astral project?
I've had. I wouldn't say I was trying to think. I've had quite very intense lucid dreams, but not astral projections per se. No, I think I'd be overstating the case. I haven't had the phenomenon whereby you feel you're observing yourself. I know people who have had, and I also know someone who's seen a very convincing UFO. Just going back to UFOs for a moment, but I haven't actually. I have tried, but. Lucid dreaming, yes. I mean, I get a lot of ideas and characters and scenarios from dreams.
Nice.
Things usually begin, very often, a fragmentary phrase. The recurrent dream, though, apart from the recurrent dream of being a teacher and not knowing what I'm doing, because I used to teach for a living at one point, is of I'm reading this. I've got this typescript in front of me of this fantastic book that I've written. And it's really wonderful. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. And then but I can't read a word in it. The typography is all strange. I can't read it. And then I wake up and I always feel, that's the book that's got away, but I've got to catch up with one of these days. But does that answer your astral projection question?
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And another thing, too, I wanted to ask, and then I'd love to get into some of the novels you've put together, is the Enochian calls. Have you yourself had a experience doing these Enochian rituals and calls?
Well, the nearest I've been to a fully fledged Enochian ritual was actually in Babalon when they performed the Enochian calls in chorus, and that was very, very powerful. I can't quite describe how, but the audience, which up to this point, there were quite a few jokes and things, Crowley says various witticisms and so on, and the audience at this point, which would be enjoying the old laugh, grew very, very silent, and there was a sense of tremendous tension. And a couple of the actors said that during the rehearsals, the Enochian calls had produced this sense of tension at some point, unease for some, and excitement for others, which is interesting. One of my actresses claimed that as a result of performing Babalon, it was somehow connected with a large explosion that took place over the same time period at a petrol refinery near London. And she said it was afterwards, but I did check back and found out that it was before. So, which is a bit disappointing if you're looking for meaningful coincidences. But no, Arlene, who played Babalon, was absolutely convinced for a while that somehow we'd caused the Buncefield oil terminal explosion, which mercifully nobody was killed, although it was extremely destructive. But no, I don't think we had. Any more than we caused Cameron to take charge. Well, I hope we didn't anyway. So there's your so there's your answer.
Sure.
As I say, I'm a scribe, really, Rex.
Right.
I'm as I said before, I'm no great sort of magus or guru or anything. I'm a guy who writes things down. Sometimes, a lot of writing is slog, right? It's slog and it's repetition, it's writing and it's rewriting, take that bit out, put that back in again, and so on. But there are moments when you're just driven. You're in the groove, you're in the channel, you're in the zone. And for me, that is the magic moment when the visualization of these actions becomes, of these scenes and these people becomes very, very, very vivid. I don't want to make too much of that, I don't. When my first novel came out, one guy suggested that I should preface it as saying that it had been channeled from Crowley, and I said, no, that is not a good idea. The OTO is not going to like that.
Right.
And no, but I think the writing process is a magical process. I mean, Burroughs used to often commented on the things that would emerge in his cut-ups, which often related to incidents that were either in the news or things that were going on around him. And he said, and this is something I've learnt as I've got older, that it's all about keeping alert and just sort of watching in the moment what's going on around you and inside you. It seems very simple, sort of simple and banal to say that, but it's actually quite difficult to do. But if you can do that, then I find it releases a lot of energy, a lot of ideas and energy, which eventually find their way into words. So.
Now, you put that together so eloquently, and I like how you describe yourself as being a scribe, because you're not actually performing rituals and joining all these fraternities and getting higher ranks because of the performances and the ritualistic practices, dogmatic, etc. But you have a way of putting it in a play or in writing to where you can call it fiction or whatever, but it really describes so well, possibly, the scenarios and the past of these just remarkable characters that seem to have so much influence in people's lives, covertly and right in front of them. So it's fascinating the way that you're describing this, and I really appreciate that. So the two books that you have put together, or actually more than that, but I'm looking at two of them right now. The Polyverse.
That's the most recent one.
Okay. That's great cover, by the way. It's got the chaos magic symbol on the front of it with some neat.
That's right. Yes, there's a chaos magic symbol on it, and if you look closely, you'll also see there's some digital code, because it's in a way it's an occult cyberpunk novel, as are they all to some extent. Might make sense if I went back to the beginning.
Great.
My first novel was called The Clip-Off, based on. Which is a title has always bewildered people, except those who are interested in esoteric matters. The Clip-Off, as I'm sure you and many of your listeners know, are the forces of chaos and destruction, which, according to ancient Jewish teaching, were released during the process of creation. They're kind of leftover bits and pieces, for sort of random forces in the universe that cause chaos and upset and confusion. And yet, at another level, they are also necessary as an agent of change. And the Clip-Off in the Clip-Off, I really took two things and tried to fuse them together, and at the same time have it in a totally contemporary, more or less contemporary setting. There's the alternate universes idea, which is a staple of science fiction now. The idea that one electron away from us is another universe in which Paul Green never existed, or Paul Green was took a totally different career path and became a famous astronaut or something. I think that's very unlikely. That's a fairly standard concept. And what I tried to do is to take the idea of the multi-leveled universe and fuse that with the idea of the multi-leveled esoteric universe that you get in the Kabbalah, where you have the various sephiroth or zones of power, with Malkuth, the everyday common sense world, at the bottom, and Kether, the sort of unknowable godhead, at the top. And en route, you have Yesod, which is the sphere of sexuality. You have Hod, which is the sphere of communication and reasoning, and you have Gevira, which is which is related to Mars and to force and power and so on and so forth. And swirling around that, and you have the abyss in the middle, and swirling around that, you have these random Klepothic forces on the reverse side of the tree of life, in what Kenneth Grant calls the tunnels of Set, relating it back to Egypt and Egyptology, and Set as the dark god. So we begin with the young man who's a dropout, whose father is in a mental hospital, where he's friends with another mental patient who's an old rock musician, and he's got a mother whom he's very close to, but who's absolutely materialistic. She's a confirmed, she's Marxist-Leninist, dialectical materialism. The world is based on economics, and he goes off in search of his father to meet him in the mental hospital. But he doesn't get there because he ends up in a strange alternate world, in which magical organizations and mystical organizations are all sort of battling with each other, but it's a world which is very kind of instead of being some kind of earthly paradise, it's rather like a seedy British seaside town. It's actually based on Torquay, where I used to live in Devon, and it's full of curious rivalries. And he goes to a kind of magical college. And I wrote this long before I came up with this idea, long before Harry Potter. Harry Potter, it isn't. The only similarity is that he goes and he gets some magical training, and he falls in love. And he falls in love with two women. One of them, Layla, is, if you like, is perhaps close to the archetypal Scarlet Woman. The other one, Robin, is maybe closer to, I suppose, in Greek terms, she'd be sort of Athena. She would be a sort of quieter representation of femininity. I don't know. And it emerges that a sinister entrepreneur is working on a technology that will link the two zones, both the everyday world and this sort of hypothetical alternate world, and this releases tremendous apocalyptic destruction. So by the time we get to the second book, Beneath the Pleasure Zones, my character is a bit older now, and England is in a state of total meltdown and collapse, socially, economically, in every possible way. The cities are dominated. In the cities, most people are locked into some virtual reality, dream control experiences, which are constructed from the remnants of old video games and old adult movies. In the countryside, you've got sort of little pagan sort of communities and communes and who are trying to be self-supporting. All around them, you've got a battle going on between the heavy shepherds, who are like sort of Christian fundamentalists with machine guns and transporters, and they're fighting with the Mo boys. I think you can guess who they are, who are rather like our friends currently, or not friends, as the case may be, in Iraq and Syria. In other words, they're sort of a Daesh or ISIS type militant group. So you've got the fundamentalist Christians and the fundamentalist Muslims all beating hell out of each other, and in the middle of this, people are trying to survive, and this scenario continues on to the final book, the Polyverse, where the whole thing is kind of coming of age story in a way, because he's a little bit older in the final book, and the phenomena around him are getting stranger and stranger as the polyverse starts to unravel, and cause and effect start breaking down. Scientific cause and effect just start breaking down. And what I try to posit would be living in a magical universe wasn't necessarily living in a landscape of swords and sorceries and dragons and Games of Thrones and all that stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with that, I raise my hat to that in passing, but it was in a world where you might have a computer, but it never quite worked because it constantly changed what you were writing as you went along. And I'm not thinking of spell correction either, where you couldn't rely on a science. If you tried to carry out a scientific experiment, and I think at one point the hero actually is talking about rockets as an example of this, you can never guarantee that what you're studying will behave the same way twice. So the whole idea of a repeatable experiment goes out of the window. And as a result, in the World Wide Web morphs into something called the lobe, which is a far more unpredictable electronic network in which electronic entities actually become autonomous and mischievous, like sort of gigantic digital poltergeists. And they take the form of the quantum brothers. They usually present themselves not as monsters with two heads, but as rather respectable-looking businessmen, and they keep popping up all the time. And the quantum brothers have got their own agenda for the future of the UK, and for that matter, for the future of the Earth. And obviously the Moboys and the Heavy Shepherds have got their religious agendas, and in the middle of this, the pagans are trying to find a way through to try to resolve this. And this is not one of these scenarios where my hero saves the world, but at the end there are signs of hope. There's death and destruction, and things, and there's a lot of violence, and there's a fair bit of sexual adventure as well, both whether it's in the virtual reality zone or whether it's in the world of the Noor, if you like. So in the polyverse, everything is polymorphous and perverse. You cannot trust you cannot trust any technology to behave, and you're not sure what's real and what is, and what is fantasized. Now, these are not new ideas in themselves, but I just think I've done something rather different with them by placing them very much in an everyday Britain, which has been totally subverted and distorted and morphed. So it's a sort of not quite a disaster novel, if you know what I mean. It's almost, but there is hope at the end, and possibly there will be a sequel. We shall see.
Well, it certainly is a marathon of synapses in my mind just shooting right now, because you're so multi-leveled with these plays and writings that you put together. It certainly just creates an entire new concept of imaginary possibilities. I think it's fascinating, so definitely exercise for the mind and the soul. Now, you've got a YouTube channel, an excellent YouTube channel. So folks go to Paul Green Babalon in YouTube. Just type that in. His YouTube channel will pull up. Also, you're on scarletimprint.com.
I'm also for the novels, I'm on libroslibertad.ca for the clip-off. And you can also get that on Amazon. I think now it's out of print in the UK, yes, but I think you can get it electronically anyway from Amazon. And if you go to Mandrake, if you type in Mandrake of Oxford, you will get the publishers of the other two novels, who also do a lot of interesting paranormal and occult books, founded by a guy called Mog Morgan, along with Scarlet Imprint. It's one of the, I'd say, ground leading occult and alternative presses in the UK. And Mog does some interesting stuff. He covers a whole range of, he covers paganism, he covers traditional witchcraft, he covers the paranormal, and he does some fiction as well. He does fiction which relates to these themes. So I think you'd find something interesting there. And as for Scarlet Imprint, of course, I've got to put in a plug for my publishers. They do some wonderful books you can either buy. They do beautifully produced hardbacks, but they also do very nice high quality paperback editions of them as well. So do look at Scarlet Imprint.
Well, I certainly hope that somebody out there that has a lot of money in the media has an opportunity to listen to this broadcast, and maybe they'll give you a call and you can send them some of your plays and they can turn them into mini-series. It's just really cool concepts, man. I got to tell you.
Well, that's very generous of you, Rex. I mean, I'm not the only person to explore these areas, but I do think I put my own twist to them, and I've put in a certain amount of commitment in terms of time and energy. And as I say, have tried to engage with them imaginatively as fully as I can. So there you have it. How do you want to wind things up?
Well, I just would like to say once again, I really appreciate you spending some time with us here, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to speak with you again sometime.
That will be fun, Rex. I've really enjoyed that. Thank you for being such a patient listener to my various diversions, digressions, and devolutions. It's been a lot of fun. So you look after yourself. Whereabouts are you, by the way, geographically?
Well, I am out here in San Antonio, Texas right now, and just enjoying the nice weather. Today it's a little bit cool. Yesterday it was almost 80 degrees. So,
all right. Oh, it's pretty cool. Been pretty cold down here in Hastings. Bright but cold, and it's night, and night's fallen. And I'd just like to wish you all the best. And I shall be following the channel with great interest. And you take care of yourself.
You too, Paul. You take care of yourself. We'll talk to you again. You have a good one.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.